Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 249. Yeah, season 5, episode, I believe it's 35. Oh, no, 36. I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a wonderful week. I hope you had a quiet week. I hope you had a joyous week. I hope you had a successful week. I hope you had a blessed week. Our topic of the week this week in Coaching the Bible is on living rent-free in the competition's mind. That term rent-free is super popular. I've heard it in a lot of different contexts, in a lot of different places, and I hadn't thought about it in a biblical context or in a coaching context, although the truth is it fits in actually both. And so let's dive in right away. Season 5, episode 36, episode overall 249 on living rent-free in the competition's mind. What does it mean when someone is obsessed with another person, team, company that's not even thinking about it? In other words, you could have, let's take a sneaker war, Nike versus Adidas versus Reebok. Those are three companies that are duking it out over the years, maybe fighting it out. Coke versus Pepsi. You get the idea in the company space. They're very well aware of each other. They're thinking about each other, and they're strategizing one against the other. And at the same time, you have circumstances and situations of businesses, people who are fixated on the other, and the other has no idea that's even the case. And so it could be a person as it relates to somebody on their team. It could be a person as it relates to a quote unquote competitor. So someone who's in a competing business who they obsess over. It could be national. It could be nation level, where one nation is obsessed about another nation and the second nation has no idea that's actually going on. And so in Parshat Balak, in this section of the Torah, in this portion of the Bible, we meet a king that is so fixated on the people of Israel that he effectively wages a psychological war that they never see coming. And for the most part, they don't even know happens. And in the end, they win without even knowing that they were actually under attack. This story is a story about mental space. It's a story about perception. And it's very much a story about the power of self-containment and the ability of a leader to stay centered, to stay focused, to stay prioritized on what is the North Star, what is most important, and not get lost in something else entirely. And so in the case of sports, where we talk about a lot of different things here, where you have a competitor who is effectively what the term is used as living rent-free in your mind, then you know what we're talking about here. In, the case of, let's say, football, let's say, for example, so Tom Brady maybe is the greatest of all time. And as a player, as a competitor, others thought about him when he never gave them a second look. So people who played the same position as him, people who played for other teams that he played against, and he was rock solid focused, not on the competition, on something else entirely, almost to the point where he's not reacting, he's not thinking, he's not paying attention to, and almost not even realizing that you exist. And in this week's portion, you have Balak, the king of Moab. He's the king of a country who is obsessed with the nation of Israel, with the people of Israel, who haven't even threatened him. They haven't invaded him. They haven't made any sort of posture towards invading him. They didn't even really glance his way. They bypassed him. But he can't stop thinking about them. He can't stop fixating on them. He can't stop worrying about them. And so he goes and he hires the famed prophet of the day, Bilam, to fight a spiritual holy war against them. And it doesn't work. So effectively, the people of Israel live rent-free in Balak's mind. He's obsessed, and they're unaware. And that kind of what we'll call obsessive cognitive occupation is enormously powerful and incredibly dangerous if you are Balak or the modern version of, or someone on his team, or someone in his family. And because he begins to go through that, he's no longer acting as a rational actor. He's no longer acting in strategy. He's spiraling. And so, as we described earlier, the real world example is your team rivalry. Again, it could be an actual rival on another team. It could be within your own team. So there's a person on who works with you who can't let go of a peer's success and starts fixating and reinterpreting and interpreting again every email, every win as some sort of a personal slight. There is startup envy, let's say, where a rising founder can't stop watching the competition's every move, whether it's press, product, marketing, PR, pivots, movements, whatever it is, and they're operating out of reaction versus strategy and good sense. You have it at the national level where a government is building its military positions and it's making its diplomatic efforts around a perceived threat and not one that's active. But it takes up a lot of real estate in their mind. We're living it right now. For the most part, a lot of the threats that surround us here in the Middle East, they're legit threats, but they're not threats that we're actively imposing, let's say, on what we would call enemies. It's us living rent-free inside the mind of the people who are our enemies. I think if we had a choice, perhaps we might never, ever think about them or ever consider them. And yet we have to. But we go about the business of day-to-day life and we don't obsess about them as individuals. Maybe the military does and the government does, but other people are operating and maneuvering and manipulating and doing everything to annihilate, destroy, remove, whatever you want to term you want to use. We're living rent-free inside the space of their mind. It's the same, just thousands of years later. And so in the case of Balak in the Bible, he panics. He saw, the Bible tells us, he saw what the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, had done to his, let's say, his local enemies or his neighbors. He saw them take land that generations before had been land that belonged to Moab that no longer does. And now he sees them sitting in the plain, in their case, effectively waiting to go into the land of Israel. They do not even know he's there. They do not even know he exists. They do not give him 1 second of 1 moment of 1 day of thought. And had the Bible not recorded the story, they would never know it. And so his panic turns to fear, and his fear turns into an obsession, and his obsession leads to the profit for hire. And so I'll ask you, before we go deeper into understanding how this might work or why this is a thing, some of the questions that I think are really important for us as leaders. Who or what is taking up a disproportionate amount of space in real estate in your mind right now? Let's leave maybe the national stress and anxiety and tension out of it, but zoom in on yourself. Is it a competitor? Is it some sort of a critic? Relatedly, then, what is the emotional trigger behind that perhaps obsessive focus? Is it fear? Perhaps it's envy or jealousy? Some sort of uncertainty? Anxiety about your own position? Related question. I'm thinking about that, but am I thinking about that, and as a result of it, is my attention fully aligned still with my actual goals, or have I been hijacked? How do I know? Am I in obvious reaction mode, or am I in building mode? Am I focused on my own metrics of success, working towards the goals or the results that I had laid out with myself, with my team, with my board, with my spouse, with my family? Or am I simply just always measuring and checking against the competition? Or another question, what story am I telling myself about them? And then as a result, what's the cost that story is actually having on me? Am I assigning motive and threat and power to them that doesn't actually exist? Am I creating narrative, building stories that aren't actually there? These are all very powerful questions. So what then is actually happening inside the mind when someone or something is living rent-free in there? And so at a psychological level, this is what's called cognitive fixation. It's a form of attentional bias where your mind becomes stuck on some sort of a stimulus or a thought, even when it is certainly no longer useful or accurate. In an article in 1989, the Journal of Experimental Psychology, it was written that this kind of fixation reduces our creativity, narrows our ability to make good decisions, and traps a leader always in reactive mode. And so it's not that you're simply, and this is an important distinction, noticing the other, noticing the competition, aware of them. You are orienting around them, because of them, based on them. You are surrounding your strategic freedom to this level of emotional entrapment. And so to understand this even further at a deeper level, neuroscientist David Rock introduced something called the SCARF model, which is 5 domains that the brain treats as social survival triggers. We may have mentioned the SCARF model once in 249 episodes, I don't know. And so what happens in the SCARF model is this. We have status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And so when our status or our certainty is threatened, as it was the case for Balak in the Bible, who saw Israel as a very powerful and unpredictable and maybe a blessed nation, the brain responds as if it's in danger. And so the amygdala, that part of the brain, sort of that fear emotional section, gets hijacked. Our ability is then to focus narrow, and we become obsessively attentive to that thing. It almost goes to the point of social panic. That's part 1, is the SCARF idea. Status and certainty, those first 2 really important. Additionally, we have this idea of projection. Carl Jung talks about the idea that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size, and that this is, in fact, Balak's pattern. Jung doesn't say that about Balak. I'm telling you that that's Balak's pattern. He's projecting his anxiety outward. He's narrating that threat, or creating a threat where there isn't one. And then it becomes a campaign of panic. And then he spends exorbitantly on it. So he's putting out defense where no defense is necessary out of a threat that he is creating in his own mind. That's a narrative that he's creating in his own mind that he's projecting based off of his own anxiety as the leader of this nation. And so you as a leader, wherever that case may be, must pay attention to what is going on and what is occupying your mind and your thoughts. And if it borders on or moves into the space of obsession, so then that's a signal. Paying attention to that almost obsession or that borderline obsession should be the signal for you as the leader that you have moved out of a space of strategy and noticing into a space of what we'll call fixation, what we'll call living rent-free, and that's where the problem starts. And then we have to pull it back. So if you're constantly comparing, if you're constantly tracking someone else's move, if you're constantly spending more energy watching them than you are building or working on yourself, then you might be Balak. He's not wrong to be aware. It's the leader's responsibility to pay attention and to protect his people. That is always true. But when it goes to the space of obsession, that's not true. And so the idea then for you as a leader is to stop giving power to ghosts and to stop fighting shadows. When you fixate, and when we fixate on the rivals, we give them our focus. And when we give them our focus, we are then liable to forget our own mission. And this then living rent-free idea isn't just some sort of a meme or something funny that people say. It's a warning to a leader. It means that someone else is hijacking the real estate of your mind and your emotional bandwidth, and you're going to be less available and less successful overall. And so a leader has to then put in the protective measures that keep their focus on the bigger prize and stay away from things like a narrative bias or the creation of an enemy that doesn't actually exist. You can see it in the Bible there in the story as he's bringing Bilam into the story and trying to curse the people for whatever reason. Is he jealous of the people of Israel? Maybe. Is he afraid of them? Certainly. Does he have reason to be afraid of them? Does not appear to be the case. He has no idea. He has created the narrative about them that an attack is impending, and they're going to destroy him and take his land. Is it true? Doesn't appear to be true. Could they have attacked him already? Yes. Were they already told that that nation is not one that they could actually attack? Yes. They were told that. He doesn't know that. He creates a different narrative, an alternative story. Or maybe it's jealousy. He simply just looks at them and they're successful in this march towards this land, and they're just pummeling and destroying enemies that he has seen, that he perhaps has fought against, that he has lost against in the past. And now this makes him look small and weak. Is he at risk from them? So there's a lot of reasons as to why this is going on. It doesn't necessarily explain properly what Balak is actually doing. Now let's flip it over for a second because it's important. And maybe this is a psychological advantage that you have over your competition, over somebody else, that I don't know if you are poking it or stoking it or using it to your benefit. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. But let's look at the other side of that for just a second. The people themselves, people of Israel, who have attained or acquired this space in the mind of the king of Moab, have no idea that they've done that. It was not something that they intended to do. It's the outcome of their efforts, let's say. So why do they live rent-free in his mind? One, their reputation precedes them. Exodus, Mount Sinai, 40 years in the desert, now conquering nations. There's a story there. They have a clear purpose, which is to go into the land. They have no interest in him whatsoever. Maybe that's unsettling to him. They stayed mission focused. And maybe their focus, that ability to stay on message, to stay on point, to stay on mission, to stay on the path towards the land. The sense that they're not reacting, that they're not acting, that they're not attacking, maybe intensifies his anxiety because he doesn't quite understand them, doesn't quite see how they're actually working. They are who they are. They're doing what they're doing. They're going where they want to go. And he is an afterthought to them. They stand for something. They have a mission. They have a purpose. So it's an interesting lesson on the flip side of this is not just the idea of living inside or having someone living rent-free inside your mind, but the other side of that here is also this. Sometimes the most potent form of influence isn't actually noise. It's being non-reactive and purely staying purpose-driven at all points. So you get some really power ideas here about obsession, about fixation. And then we have to work on it because if we're the leader, we have to reclaim our mind. We are responsible to our team, to our family, to ourselves, to be our best selves, to show up as our best version of ourselves and not one that's fixated on an enemy, on a competitor, but that's fixated on our own inputs, our own systems, our own results, our own values, our own ethics. And so number one then, from a practical standpoint, leader, is to name the narrative, which we talk about a lot. What's the story I am stuck in? What loop is playing in my head all the time about this person, this situation, and is it helpful? Write it down. That's always number one, is really to name it. Once you put words to it, you're able to unpack it. You're able to pull it apart. You're able to see it for all of the different variables and factors that are there. Number two is action. This came from a different conversation I had with somebody last week in a podcast that I did. It's work-related, the Ramy and Binny Show, where they talked about the idea of action over fear. That when a person feels or finds himself in a position of being afraid, of being nervous, of being scared, that in that moment, sitting and doing nothing doesn't help. And so taking action in that moment is of the greatest value and the greatest import. That's the case here too. Switch to action from the noise. If you're fixated on the competitor, fixated on this enemy, quote unquote, then you're amplifying the noise. You're giving it more space. It simply just echoes further. And so shift your attention to one concrete next step that I can do, that you can do right now, that answers this. What can I build or do that actually moves something forward for me today that has nothing to do with that? That works. Action. The third thing I would say here then is also relatedly is a mental exercise. And ask yourself the question, if this ever happens to you, whose voice am I letting echo in my head today? Who's going to control the mental narrative, the psychological, spiritual narrative of my work, of my focus, of my efforts today? And if initially it appears to be the competition, the villain, whoever that may be, then we have to take a stand and say, I choose not to give free rent to whatever it is that's draining me right now. Instead, I choose Y. So X is I choose not to allow X to happen, and Y is I choose Y to happen in my own. And then perhaps the last one, also again, a mental exercise, but again, could be done with writing with yourself or the team itself, is to reaffirm the why of your work. That's WHY, the why, and the mission. Sometimes this happens where we have doubts about ourselves or doubts about our abilities or doubts about what we can actually accomplish or doubts about how big or important the work that we're doing. And so when we reaffirm it, when we relook at it, when we take the time to rethink about it or look at our successes to this point, that gives us confidence. And that confidence can move us to action. And that confidence can move us away from the fixation or the anxiety or the stress or the tension or the narrative bias that we are allowing to live so freely inside our minds. And so reaffirm the mission. And so what we talked about here then in the practical sense is to name it, name the story that I'm telling myself. 2, look for a practical step that I can take right now. 3, the mental exercise of not allowing the space to be given to somebody else and to affirm that I'm taking that space back for myself. And then lastly is to reaffirm the mission and the why of the work that it is you're trying to do. And as always, we'll end with a quote. Here's a quote from Naval Ravikant, which is this: "The enemy is not out there. The enemy is the story you tell yourself about what's out there." Because a lot of the time, it's not true. A lot of the time, it's not real. A lot of the time, it's our projection. It's our bias. It's our anxiety. It's our stress. It's our tension, putting it out there that maybe soothes us, that maybe excuses something for us, but is not actually true and is mostly getting in the way of what it is that we can accomplish. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. As always, wishing you a blessed and a gorgeous and incredible weekend. Look forward to seeing you next week.